Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to part 5 of our Watering Wisdom Growing a Healthy Lawn with Less Water webinar series. My name is Shane Evans, and as usual, we have our typical panel members, which include me, Dr. Eric Watkins from the University of Minnesota, and Dr. Brian Davis of the Metropolitan Council. We also have Chris Moncada, who is going to be running our Q&A session, as she has done for the previous webinars. But before we jump into our topic for today, I just wanted to let everyone know about our previous webinars. If you haven't been a part of the series up to this point, we do have our previous webinars recorded. And here's the 4 of them that are listed there. And we'll have this webinar, or excuse me, that URL you see at the bottom sent out with the email that comes out the following day after this webinar, where you can access not only this recording today, but again, those previous 4 webinars that we have already recorded. Now, to give you a quick overview of Zoom, again, if this is your first time joining us, the chat function is disabled, but there will be a Q&A or a question and answering section at the end of the webinar presentation. So if you would like to ask a question at any time during the presentation, feel free to hover over that Q&A box, and there should be something that you see there on the right that pops up, and that's where you can type your questions. And again, we'll be answering those at the end of the webinar today. So with that, I guess, I have given most of the presentations, and also Dr. Eric Watkins and Dr. Brian Davis had helped a little bit. So I guess you could say we're having somewhat of a guest presenter today. Recently graduated student Ryan Schwab is going to be running the webinar today, and it's entitled Winterizing Your Lawns. So with that, Ryan, I'll turn the time over to you. And then again, we'll have Chris Moncada running our Q&A session with all of our panelists, including Ryan, after his presentation. So with that, Ryan, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Shane, for the introduction. And thank you everybody for tuning in and allowing me to come and be your guest presenter on Winterizing Your Lawn for the Twin Cities. I first would like to start this presentation by just going over the goals of winterizing your lawn in Minnesota. The first of which being to have a healthy stand of grass going into winter so that it can survive winter and have earlier spring green up. So this goes into a lot of our management practices that we are doing throughout the year, especially in the fall, just to make sure our grass is as healthy and stress-free as possible. Secondly, and this is a very important goal, and that is to minimize environmental damage or just be very environmentally aware when we are doing any of our lawn care practices. And this should be something we think about not only in the fall and winterizing our lawn, but also just throughout the growing season while we are managing our properties. Now, to catch everybody up as far as what we do on our lawns in the fall. Fall is actually a very busy time for lawn care. We prefer to do a lot of different practices. So here's a lawn care calendar for the fall. We've got the months of September through November listed here, and all of the practices listed on the far left column. Anything from fertilizing to mowing, broadleaf weed control, seeding, sodding. A lot of this we would prefer homeowners to do in the fall. If we're looking at this lawn care calendar, the P's indicate a preferable time to do that practice, and the A refers to an acceptable time to do that practice. Now, the reason why we do so much in the fall is because a lot of the annual weeds are starting to die down. Some of the perennial weeds are starting to prepare for winter, and they slow their growth. So if we can do any management practice that will increase the growth or thicken our turf on our lawn, we should do so that it will be more competitive the following year into the spring. And also, when we do some of these practices and try to keep our turf as healthy and stress-free as possible going into winter, That will reduce the amount of winter kill that we have to deal with in the following spring. So by doing some of these practices and staying on top of our fall lawn care, we'll likely need to use less resources in the spring to recover our lawn, and that includes water, which has been the focus of this series so far. All right, so here's just a general overview of what I will be covering today. First of which we will be going over mowing practices in the fall, and this covers leaf management as well. We will talk about fall fertilization, winterizing your irrigation system. Next, we'll cover dormant seeding and its advantages. And then lastly, we'll talk about minimizing salt damage on your lawn. The first thing I want to cover on mowing practices in the fall is the recommendation of lowering your height of cut on your lawn, lowering the cut of your grass. And this should be a gradual thing. We don't want to cut off too much grass at once. So while we're, for example, if we are maintaining our lawn from 3.5 to 3 inches during the whole year, we'd probably want to reduce that down to 2 to 2.5 inches in the fall, and gradually step down to a height that seems like your grass can respond to it. So you don't want to take off too much tissue at a time. There's this rule of thumb called the rule of 1/3. And this means that we only want to remove about 1/3 of the height of the grass during one mowing event, because we do not want to damage the turf. Now, this rule, as well as other practices, have been covered in that part 4 of the webinar series. So if you have not yet listened in on that, be sure to check that out after this webinar. Now, why do we lower the mowing height in the fall? Well, we do so to help reduce the amount of damage we get from different pests that occur during the winter and into the spring. First of which is snow mold. So snow mold is something we tend to see in the spring as the snow melts back. We'll see that fuzzy stuff on the grass. And this typically doesn't kill the grass, but it will slow down the greening up of it in the spring, which might be somewhat unsightly. So by cutting it a little bit shorter, we're actually removing some of its habitat. So in cutting it shorter, we can likely have less snow mold. So here's a picture on the top left-hand corner of 2 plots. The one on the left was mowed at 1.5 inches going into winter, and the one on the right was mowed at 3.5 inches going into winter. Now, this picture was taken early spring this year, and you can tell that the plot that was cut at the higher cut, the 3.5 inch, definitely has more snow mold damage than the 1.5 cut turf. So lowering your height of cut can help reduce snow mold occurrences. Additionally, when lowering the mowing of height, we're also reducing the habitat for voles or field rodents. Now, voles are very common in the Twin Cities. They like to tunnel along the surface of the soil, and they chew through the grass. And they tend to like taller grass that's flopped over so that they can have a nice little area to live. So if we reduce the amount of vegetation or the height of cut on our grass, we're actually removing some of that habitat, or the probability of them to use that lawn area as an area in which they will be living and tunneling throughout the whole winter. If you've ever seen your lawn with some sort of like a spider or lightning type of tunnels on it, and you've never known what it is, it's likely a vole that's causing that. So lowering your height of cut can help reduce these pests. And another thing to note is both of these generally don't cause a lot of kill on our grass. Our grasses tend to recover from these. It just slows down the greening up of the grass in the spring. Now, we get a lot of questions about leaves and what to do with our leaves. We see a lot of people like to blow the leaves off their lawn or rake them up. We generally would recommend the leaves stay on the lawn, and there are benefits in doing so. We can mulch the leaves so that they can add nutrients or organic matter to our soil. When the leaves are broken up and are being placed back into the soil, they'll eventually be broken down even further, and the nutrients in those leaves can be used by our lawn later on. Additionally, they do add some organic matter, so we get a little bit better water retention in the upper portion of the root zone for our lawn as well. Additionally, another benefit is that there is some evidence that by keeping the leaves on your lawn and mulching them in, you could have reduced spring weeds, specifically dandelions, in the following growing season. So that might be an advantage as well. Now, I mentioned mulching, and I know not everybody has the options to do so, but there are some things we can do to help mulch those leaves. There are attachments for our mowers, different mulching blades. For example, in this picture on the left, I've got my push mower, and there's this bagger chute on the back, which is that hole you see in the back of the mower. Now there's a mulching attachment that will actually block the grass from being shot through that bagger chute. And it allows the grass or the leaf clippings to remain in the housing of the lawnmower longer, so that they get chewed up by the blade a little bit more finer, and then they can be recycled back into the lawn. Additionally, some mowers have mulching blades, or you may want to replace your straight blade with a mulching blade in the fall. Mulching blades are designed to keep the clippings and the leaves airborne within the housing of your mower, so that they get cut up more finely as you mow. Mulching blades tend to have different shapes, such as the one on the top of the picture on the right. Now that blade has 3 different cutting edges, so that keeps some of the material airborne. Additionally, some of the mulching blades will have this and some of these gator teeth, the blade teeth, as you see in the bottom of that picture on the right. Now, if you don't have any of these options available to you, you can still use your regular mower and the regular side chute that it has. You could maybe just slow down a little bit while you mow to try to chop up everything as fine as possible. Or if that doesn't seem to work, if everything seems to be shooting out of that side chute, and not breaking up as much as you'd like, you can always mow a second time going a different direction and see if that works. So we often get this question of, well, how many leaves are too many leaves? Is there such thing as having too many leaves? And yes, too many leaves is a thing. And I'll illustrate why in the next slide. But our yards tend to have different densities of trees in them, so we expect that the densities of leaves on our lawns will differ as well. So here's a series of photos that a newspaper reporter sent to a former colleague of ours to see what our colleague would recommend to do with these leaves. Now, we would recommend the pictures from A, B, and C, that we would just mulch those leaves back into the lawn. They're not too dense. However, in the picture D, we might consider removing some of that leaf material, as it might be a little bit too much for the grass. And there are a couple of reasons for that, why there might be such thing as too many leaves. The first of which is that too many leaves may cause an increase in snow mold in your yard. Here's a picture I took of my home lawn on the left, where I had actually blown off some of the leaves on the surface. So this is not all of them, but I had a nice fine mat of leaves on the ground. And I had quite a bit of snow mold damage on the lawn in the spring, and it recovered very slowly. Now, the second picture on the right illustrates sort of a unique situation that I noted when I was out for a walk, or a series of walks. The homeowner blew the leaves off to the side of their yard. So the area that you see in that's green, where the grass is green, is the area where they remove the leaves in the fall. They blew them off to the side of the yard where we see that there's a lot of brown grass near the bottom. Now the leaves that was blown from the side of the yard, or from the yard into the side, they kept the leaves on there over winter. So it was very heavy leaf coverage. And this picture was taken in the spring when they finally removed all of those leaves that stayed over winter and into part of spring. You can see that the turf grass is stressed out quite a bit, very little bit of greening up, and probably some snow mold damage as well. So too many leaves can reduce the amount of sunlight that is penetrating into our plants, so they're not actively growing, as well as can contribute to snow mold damage. So we recommend mulching your leaves, but if you have a little bit too much where it's creating a mat, it's probably a good idea to remove some of those. Now, there are a couple of things to think about as far as the timing of mowing in the fall. In general, we probably want to mow until the grass stops growing. We want to be able to allow the grass to adapt to whatever height we are lowering it down to. We want to allow the grass to adapt to that. So one thing in mind is we don't want to have our last mow be the one that is the one where we're lowering it. We want to make sure that we have several mowing events at that lowest level of height of cut that you're setting your lawn mower at. Additionally, we want to avoid mowing or walking on our yard when there is a lot of frost, when there's heavy frost coverage on the lawn. And that's illustrated here in the picture on the right, where we've got a golf cart that went through a golf rough while there was heavy frost, and the cart caused some damage. You can see the tracks of damage that the golf cart caused. Now, this is generally not a big deal, but then going ahead and thinking about our goals for winterizing our lawn, we want to make sure our grass is as stress-free as possible going into winter. So I know sometimes it's very difficult to determine if there is frost or if it's just some dew or water droplets on our grass. And if we really need to mow and we want to make sure we're not mowing on our frosted turf, a way to indicate if we have frost on our turf is to simply put a glove over your hand and then brush the back end of that glove on the turf grass blades. And if the back of your hand is wet, then we know that the frost is melted already. However, if you have some frost, or if it's completely dry on the back of your glove, then that means that there's still frost on your lawn, and you may need to wait quite a little bit longer before you take the lawn and start mowing it. Now let's hop over into fertilization, fall fertilization. Now, the point of fertilization is to simply supply what your soil lacks. Our plants are trying to get its nutrients from the soil. So whatever our soil has for our plants is what it's going to get. A way to see how much nutrients we have in our soil and what recommendations we would give as far as what type of fertilizer schedule and regime we want to do, we can undergo a soil test. And then we could turn in that soil to a soil testing laboratory. And we actually have one here at the University of Minnesota. I've got the link of that at the top of the page here. But a soil test report looks like this that you see here on the right. It'll tell us a few things about our soil, the different levels of nutrients, the pH, the amount of organic matter we have in our soil. This is all based upon the samples that you've given the laboratory. And then at the very bottom of the page, they've got recommendations listed for us, the amount of nitrogen that we want to put down on our lawn per year, the amount of phosphate, the amount of potash. So all of these things are extrapolated based upon the soil that we have in our yard. So that's where I would recommend any of us starting as far as knowing what to put down as far as fertilizer goes for our grass. Now, fertilizing is probably most important in the fall. We would recommend fertilizing anytime between mid-August to mid-October. And this is, again, so that our grass can be as competitive as possible as the weeds and as the annual weeds begin to die and as the perennial weeds begin to winterize. Additionally, our grass plants are also trying to winterize. So by fertilizing in the fall, we are ensuring that they are getting what they need to store the energy because they are staying alive throughout the winter. So as I stated before, we just want to make sure our grass is not nutrient deficient going into winter. We want to have it as healthy as possible so that it has the energy reserves to stay alive and well surviving winter. One thing I do want to note is that we should probably avoid late fall applications of fertilizer. And this is to reduce some nutrient pollution. And if we were to apply nutrients or fertilizer too late, that fertilizer is not being used by anything, not by our plants, not by microbes. It's simply sitting on the surface. And if we think about our late falls, our winters and our springs, we get a lot of weird rain events. We get freeze-thaw cycles. We get flushes of snow melt. And with that, it can pull nutrients from the surface of our soil and move it off site. And that could cause some nutrient pollution in our waterways. Additionally, if we add frozen soils to that, it could make it even worse because the water has a tough time penetrating through, infiltrating through our root zone. Also, if we were to apply specific fertilizers, such as those that need to be like organic fertilizers that need to be broken down by microorganisms, or those that need to be opened up by a physical abrasion, some of those slower release products, if we were to apply those a little bit too late, then they won't be used by anything because they won't be broken down by microorganisms due to the really low soil temperatures. So timing of fertilizer is very important, especially when we think about minimizing environmental damage and just being an environmental steward of our yard. So this information, as well as some others, has been covered in part 4 of the webinar series. So again, check back on that if you haven't yet so far. We also get questions about winterizer fertilizers, and these type of fertilizers have moderate to high potassium levels. So a typical winterizer fertilizer bag might be a 10-0-14 and 18-0-18 or so on. That fertilizer analysis is a series of 3 numbers that I just stated. That third number is the potassium level within that bag of fertilizer. Now, if we have a soil test that says we need to have this potassium in our soil, as well as any other nutrients that is in that bag, then I would recommend using a winterizer fertilizer, but generally these are not needed, especially in Minnesota, where we do have quite a bit of nutrients already in many of our soils. But again, if you have a soil test that states that you need it, and you haven't yet put it down in the fall or in the spring, then you may do so, but generally not needed, and it might just add to the costs of your lawn care, lawn management. Next, let's move on to irrigation and what to do with the outdoor water and when to shut it off. Well, a good rule of thumb is to shut it off when the grass stops growing. We don't need to keep watering when our grass is no longer growing. Or when we start to experience some freezing temperatures. But also we could probably get away with shutting the water off before the plants stop growing, because in fall we are generally somewhat wet. And also with the colder temperatures, our soils tend to retain the water longer for longer periods, which can be used by our plants. And in general, plants start to grow a little bit slower as well. So you probably get away with shutting the water off before the grass stops growing. And that's the outdoor water, that is. If you have a garden hose, a sprinkler head, some nozzles out in your yard, it's probably best to try to drain those out to remove any water from those lines. As water freezes in a hose, for example, it will expand and it might cause some damage, or it might loosen up an area that might eventually pop later on in the next growing season when you use it. So making sure any outdoor components are completely drained is a good way to avoid any damage to those parts. And the same thing goes for underground irrigation systems. So if you have an underground irrigation system, you'd want to do a system blowout. Sometimes these are just called winterizing your irrigation system from some lawn care companies. But an irrigation blowout involves using pressurized air right next to your backflow preventer, and it'll push the water through each individual zone. So it'll remove water from your irrigation pipe, from the valves within each zone, and from all the heads in the zone as well. And this is again to just avoid any damage that freezing and expanding water may have. You may think, the irrigation pipes are buried down into the ground, but with a Minnesota winter, they aren't down far enough to avoid freezing temperatures, to avoid the freezing soil around it. So this is a very good practice. Just remove all the water to avoid any damage that may occur. Now, irrigation blowouts are generally done by professionals, by professional contractors, irrigation contractors, lawn care companies. The reason being is that they do usually have a really large air compressor, something that has a large volume of air. So this allows them to do many zones without having to reload that air compressor. So it tends to be a very quick process for them. Additionally, these are somewhat cheap, anywhere from $50 to $150, and this depends on the amount of zones you have in your yard. So as you increase the amount of zones, that'll also increase the amount of money that it'll cost. And this is not to say that you can't do it by yourself. Homeowners can definitely do this by themselves. The only thing I would say about that is a typical homeowner's air compressor is generally small. So it might be a little bit more timely because you'd have to wait for that to reload some more pressure within that tank over time. So just some things to think about as far as irrigation blowing out as well. One last thing I forgot to mention is sometimes there are specific components that you need to hook up your air compressor to the opposite end of the backflow preventer. And generally professionals already have these different components. So that's something that you'd have to look into as a homeowner if you plan to do this by yourself. Next, let's cover seeding. So when we seed in the fall, we would generally recommend seeding sometime between mid-August to mid-September. And when we seed at those time periods, the goal of that is to try to allow the seed to germinate and for us to establish a lawn before winter. But if we miss that window from mid-August to mid-September, we can do what's called dormant seeding, which generally occurs sometime between, sometime in mid to late November, but it really depends on the type of fall we're having. This is putting down seed before the soil is frozen, but when it's still too cold for the seed to germinate. So usually when the grass stops growing, shortly after that is probably when we could probably put down seed for dormant seeding. Now the seed will stay on the soil over winter, and then when the snow melts and when the temperatures begin to increase in the soil, the seed will begin to germinate pretty early in the spring. Usually on any given year, the turfgrass seed will germinate and begin to establish a few weeks before even crabgrass begins to germinate. So it really gives us a competitive edge on some of the annual weeds that pop up from year to year in our locations. So it's somewhat of an advantage to try to get this dormant seeding in if we hadn't yet done seeding in that earlier fall window. Now, one very important thing for dormant seeding is erosion control, and this is especially important if we have some sloped surfaces on our yard. So there are a couple options for dormant seeding, erosion control, and that is, the first one here I'm showing on the right is a erosion blanket. So in this instance, I seeded the lawn, And then I put the blanket down, and then I watered the blanket down so that the blanket would stick to the soil and it would hold the seed in place. So in the spring, when we have a flush of snow melts and that water's running off site, it's not carrying the seed with it. The seed stays in place. And we could do something similar if we just seed into an existing stand of grass. As long as we have some soil exposure where the seed can be contacted with the soil, as you see in the picture to the left, the existing grass will help be a physical barrier for seed movement. So the seed might move a little bit when we have some runoff or some snow melt or freeze thaw cycles, but in general, it'll stay where you want it to stay because of the existing turf that's there. So there are a couple options there, but erosion control is a pretty important thing when thinking about dormant seeding and keeping the seed where you want it to be. Next, I'll be covering salt damage, and this is something that I know many of us know it's very hard to avoid in Minnesota with the amount of salt that's used on our roadways, on sidewalks, driveways, just throughout the state to help prevent any injuries or just to keep our environment safer as far as transportation and going to and from our areas. But I do have some pointers as far as trying to minimize the amount of salt damage that we have on our lawns or our boulevards. The first of which is to establish grasses that are more salt tolerant. And through some research that we've done with the Minnesota Department of Transportation, we've found that fine fescues are one of the more salt tolerant turfgrass species of the turf grasses that we use here in Minnesota. This is not to say that they won't get damaged by salt. If we have too much salt concentrated in one area, we could always damage any of the turf grasses that we plant here. But it just seems to be one of the more tolerant of species. So establishing fine fescues in these areas where we tend to get a lot of salt damage, such as boulevards, edges of driveways and sidewalks, might be a good practice for this next growing season or something to think about before next fall. Additionally, we can just try to use the least amount of salt as possible through just mechanically removing the ice and snow as much as we can within these walkways and sidewalks, so that we're saving on salt and we're not putting it down if we don't necessarily need to. Very similarly, thirdly, we want to make sure that we're placing salt where it is needed. I know many times the salt is being applied using some sort of a fertilizer or rotary spreader. Just make sure that that salt isn't being tossed into a turfgrass area and it's maintaining or it's staying on a sidewalk or a driveway or wherever it is absolutely needed. This also goes into placing it in areas where we tend to have high traffic, foot traffic, just placing salt where you think is needed to keep everybody safe and away from the turfgrass. Additionally, we want to make sure that we're placing salt when it is needed. So this is, not just using salt as a security blanket, throwing it out into the environments just to do so, to make yourself feel better. You want to use it when you know you're going to have a buildup of ice, when you already have a bunch of ice, or when you know you're going to have a lot of foot traffic in a specific area someday. So just use salt where and when needed, and that'll save you on salt as well. And also, there are alternatives to rock salt. Rock salt is sodium chloride. It's similar to the table salt that we eat every day. But there are some alternatives. Usually a little bit more expensive. Some for traction, some good alternatives for traction are sand and also red quartzite, which some people refer to as cherry grit. And it's becoming a more and more popular option as it doesn't track through the house as much as sand would, as far as being some sort of a traction alternative. And then some salt alternatives, we have calcium magnesium acetates, calcium chloride, potassium chloride. These are generally more expensive than rock salt, especially calcium magnesium acetate, which is generally one of those products that are typically labeled for pet-friendly use. One thing I do want to note, if we were to use a rock salt alternative or rock salt in general, we want to make sure that we're putting it down when it's going to be effective. Some of these only help penetrate through the ice when temperatures are 15 or 18 degrees or higher. Now, I know with all of us living in Minnesota, we know our winters get much, much colder than that. So be sure we're placing salt down in area or during times at which it will be effective is something we should look into as well. Lastly, here's just a quick idea that I've done in the past, and that is to make a list. Make a list of what worked, what didn't work as far as your lawn care management goes this past year. Maybe fertilizing at a specific time helped reduce some sort of disease in your lawn. Maybe jot that down so you could do the same thing the next year. You could write down any suggestions that you may have, something that you learned for the next growing season that you'd be willing to try. Any repairs that need to be done, services, products that you might want to do right away. I know a big one is irrigation systems. Sometimes it's hard to get an irrigation system repair in right away in the fall, because a lot of these companies are really busy with all their fall lawn care management practices they have to do and serve with other people. So if you have anything with your irrigation system, you want to be sure to get that fixed right away, because we don't want to be wasting water right away in the spring. That's a bad way to start your growing season. And then lastly, place this list of suggestions or things that you need. Place it somewhere where you'll find it right away in the spring. A place where I've always put mine is in my irrigation clock. So when I fire up the irrigation clock in the spring, I'd find that list, and it'd be a great reminder of what I was thinking about in the previous fall. So I guess I do want to thank again everybody for listening in on our webinar. I know this is kind of a weird format to have some sort of a seminar. So I thank you for all your patience and listening in. I want to thank the Metropolitan Council as well, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Ryan. That went well. So our first question is, how should I manage my yard if I do have snow mold come springtime?
Right. So if you have snow mold in the spring, a good idea is to, well, one thing that you can try to take care of right away, very early in the spring or late in the winter, is reduce some of those giant piles that you have in your yard. Usually snow mold tends to occur where you have these larger banks and snow sticks around a little bit longer. Try to spread that out a little bit, or remove some of that snow and some of those giant piles. That'll reduce how long that snow mold will stick around. You could also just do a general rake through the area to circulate more air in the area as well. That usually helps a little bit as well.
Okay, the next question for Ryan is, how can we mulch leaves into our grass with a push mower? Right.
So if we go back to that mulching page, there are different things we could do. So if you have a bagger on your push mower, there's something that you could probably put in the back of that back chute to block the leaves and the clippings from blowing through that back chute. It keeps everything in the housing of your mower. If you have a push mower that's shooting leaves off to the side, if you have a side chute, look for your manufacturer's website. They probably have some sort of an attachment to stop or block that side chute. Sometimes you can find full mulching kits, which would involve those blocking attachments, as well as mulching blades that you can change out on your mower. I know a lot of push mowers nowadays already have those mulching blades on them, not the ones with teeth, but the ones that have multiple levels to them. And so that's something you could just already look at your mower and see if you already have that. Then that would be something to look into. So Yeah, there are options out there. I would just suggest looking at the manufacturer of your mower to see if there's anything that you could order or do, or just see if you already have something available at your house.
Okay, here's another great question for Ryan. I know he's a dog lover. Are all lawn fertilizers safe for use in animal areas, i.e. dogs getting it on their paws and then licking the salt off their paws? Oh, lawn fertilizers, I'm sorry.
Right. So I don't know too much about this. I am a dog lover. So fertilizers can burn the paws of dogs, and usually it's with fertilizers that are the more quicker release fertilizers. And if there's a higher concentration of them in a specific area, that's usually when we start to worry about our dogs. In general, what I've always followed is if I fertilize the lawn, I try to water it in, try to knock it down into the soil as much as possible. If you're worried about your dogs walking on your lawn after fertilizing it, maybe try to train them to stay off of the lawn for just temporarily until that gets worked into the soil. Yeah, that's something that you could probably look into as far as the type of fertilizer you're using, or the manufacturer of that fertilizer as well.
Okay, so our next question is, are there particular seeds that are considered dormant seed? For Ryan.
No. The seed will respond to the environment that it's in. So if we put the seed in a cold environment, like a late fall environment, it will not germinate. The seeds respond to its environment. So if it gets enough water and if it gets enough sunlight, then it will start to germinate. But if we're putting it down at a time in which it's not getting it, then it will remain dormant.
Okay, here is another seeding question. I did some fall seeding and I'm wondering if I should skip aeration this fall. I've aerated the past 2 falls.
You could, if you're concerned about reducing the density of the grass that you just newly seeded. If you have quite a bit of seedlings, you might want to hold off on it this year, especially if you've been doing it recently. You could always do an aeration in early spring as well, before everything starts really growing, because we don't want to damage some of those juvenile plants going into winter. So if you've been doing it and you're worried about those juvenile plants, you might want to hold off this year.
Okay, our next question for Ryan is, when should you start reducing height of mowing grass to get it down to 1.5 inches? Mid-August?
I'd probably start September. And 1.5 inches is very low. I do want to note. 1.5 inches is something that you'd probably, if you were managing your grass already very low at, let's say 2.5 to 2 inches, lowering it down to 1.5 inches makes sense. But you just want to make sure you're not damaging the grass. And usually if you're maintaining it at 1.5 inches, or if you want to bring it down to 1.5 inches, usually that's best done when the surface is very flat, and so that you avoid damaging some of the turf going into winter. So in the example that I showed where it was down to 1.5 inches, that was in a research plot where we do have it. The plots were very flat, so we don't tend to get a lot of damage from scalping with those. But if you have been managing your grass pretty low already, you could probably lower it down to 1.5. And I would probably start in September. If you haven't started lowering it now, now's the time.
Okay, here's a question I think is referring to a previous question. What about a push mower and not a power mower? And I think they had meant the difference between push mowers and a manual mower.
Oh,
They're
you
not.
mean one of those rotary mowers?
Yeah, that's what I think they meant, that
Oh, shoot.
question.
I didn't even think about that. I don't know if there are options as far as mulching for those. Can anyone else chime in if they're, if they've seen anything? No. Yeah, I know those blades on those rotary mowers can be very sensitive. So mowing over something like a leaf might do some damage to some of those. But I'm probably just thinking of those that are used on golf courses. But yeah, I don't know if there's anything special for those push rotary mowers. I'll have to look into that.
Okay, so here's more of a general lawn care question. Is either aeration or dethatching better than the other?
Aeration is definitely better than dethatching, in my opinion. When you aerate, you're doing a few things. You are, and that's core aeration, right? That's when we're pulling the plugs out of our lawn. So we are decreasing the amount of compaction in the upper portion of our root zone. So that's a plus. We're also creating channels for air and water circulation so that our root zone it isn't lacking oxygen. We're also creating those channels for root growth. We tend to get a lot of root growth within those holes that we create. So in general, aeration also might help reduce the amount of thatch. Because when those cores that we pull out, once those break down and fall over into the top of the turf, that creates an environment for microorganisms to do their work and reduce the amount of thatch that we have in our soil. So in general, I know a lot of people just dethatch to remove some dead material, some of the dead leaf blades in their lawn. So it's usually more of an aesthetic thing than actually reducing the amount of thatch. I find aeration to be a little bit more useful as far as that goes.
Okay, so here's one of my favorite topics, bee lawns. So the question is, can you use bee lawn mixes for dormant seeding, i.e. in mid-November? So a bee lawn mix would have other species besides just turf grasses.
Right.
Brian?
Yeah. Oh, does Brian want to answer this one?
Oh, no, I said Ryan. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Yeah, absolutely. You can dormant seed those. I'll actually be doing that myself on my own home lawn. And there are plenty of, or there are a few species that have been recommended by the university as far as using for a bee lawn mixture. So be sure to order those seeds, and yeah, you can go ahead and dormant seed those. Something that I'm planning on doing myself. So.
Okay, so our next question, do you have a suggestion for winter vole damage reduction? Is it suggested to mow over and damage their tunnels as the mowing height decreases? Castor oil just seems to move them around the yard and garden.
Could you ask the question again?
Okay, sorry. Let's see.
Just the beginning.
Do you have a suggestion to reduce the damage for from winter voles? Is it suggested to mow over and damage their tunnels as the mowing height decreases?
Yeah, I don't see, reducing the mowing height just to remove some of that material to reduce their habitat might be a starting point. I don't know about too many other ways of trying to reduce or remove the voles. There are probably some rodent repellents products that we can use that I haven't yet looked into myself. I have heard from a previous homeowner that packing a bunch of snow in the back of their yard where they want the voles to be tends to help keep the voles in the back and not where on their lawn area. So that might be something you could try, is packing snow in areas that you want the voles to be. But as far as preparation this fall, just lowering the mowing height should help. It doesn't help all the time because the populations are pretty heavy in some areas, but it should help.
Okay, so the next question is, I joined very late. Maybe this was answered earlier. But is it okay to dethatch and reseed the lawn as some part of the yard has nimblewill, which is a perennial grassy weed? Is it too late to deal with that?
Right, with nimblewill, I believe, I always thought nimblewill was an annual here in Minnesota. But there are products that will help you take care of the nimblewill right now. I know there's a specific active ingredient in herbicide that you can use called mesotrione that will help slow down the growth of nimblewill. And you could also try to seed around that time, but it depends on what type of seed, what you plan to seed. If you're doing something like Kentucky bluegrass, that should be fine. Fine fescues, you should be fine. But yeah, taking care of the nimblewill through, you could try to mechanically remove it with dethatching. I don't know if that was the purpose of dethatching in that question. But you can try to remove the nimblewill by using an herbicide with the active ingredient mesotrione. That might help take care of the nimblewill. And then you could also seed or you might want to wait to seed actually. Seeding right now might be a little bit too late in the fall if you're trying to get something established before winter. So I guess with that, I'm kind of going in circles here. My suggestion for that question is to try to take care of the nimblewill with an herbicide, or if they don't feel comfortable, try to mechanically remove it, and then do a dormant seeding in November.
So the next question is going back to the push mowers again. I think this person has some experience with it regarding the leaves, and they say that we just go back and forth with our push rotary mower several times, and that does cut up the leaves somewhat.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, so let's move on to the next question. Thoughts on aeration done manually with a shovel? Or I think maybe one of those special tools. Do you think they're?
I don't know. You might be able to help. I mean, if you're using some sort of mechanical tool to like poke holes, I guess, not necessarily remove material. Is that, I guess, it might help a little bit. The advantage of using some sort of an aerator is the density of holes that you're poking. If you were to do it mechanically by yourself, you want to make sure that you have this pretty, I guess, very dense. It's tough to explain. You just want to be able to make sure that you're getting good density in the pokes that you're doing with your shovel or whatever tool that you're doing. Now, removing the material, like core aeration, reduces the compaction more than if you were to just poke a hole. Because when you poke a hole, it pushes some of the soil along the outsides, and it creates some localized compaction just around the edges of that hole that you poked. So you're generally not getting as much of the compaction alleviation when you just poke holes. But when you're removing cores, you're getting a little bit more compaction. So you could try to do it mechanically yourself. That might help with some air circulation in localized areas, or infiltration in localized areas. Or if you're the goal of doing that with seeding, that might help reveal some of the soil on the surface. But yeah, I think I answered that as best as I can.
Okay, so I guess this is kind of a popular topic, this general topic. So our next question says, I've heard another educator say that dethatching is much more rarely needed than homeowners think. They also mentioned that yearly dethatching, most of us were told to do annually, is somewhat outdated. Is there any truth to that?
I personally don't think it's needed. As I mentioned before, it's usually done for aesthetics to remove some of the dead leaf material in our lawns. You might be removing some, if you get deep enough, you are removing some of the thatch material that's stuck in there that's not being broken down readily. So it could help, especially if you're getting deep enough. But it's generally just used as a way of removing dead leaf material, and the leaf material that's in our lawn. One thing that I didn't note in this webinar is that leaf clippings from our grass or dead leaf clippings, they break down pretty rapidly in our soils. It generally doesn't contribute to thatch. So dethatching usually just removes some of that leaf material, and it'll just get broken down readily anyway. So it's usually just an aesthetic thing to try to have as much green turf as possible when there is some of that scattering, especially in the spring where we have some of the dead leaf material scattered throughout our yard. I know a lot of people dethatch to remove that, to have as much green material as possible right away in the spring.
Okay, let's go to a slight change of subject. If the pipe in my underground irrigation system breaks, how will I know?
Ooh, this is a fun one. Sometimes when that happens, you'll just simply get a puddle. Some of that water will start rising up and eventually get to the surface. So when you walk on it, it'll be squishy. And when you walk on it, a puddle occurs. But there are also instances where you get what's called a turf bubble, where the surface of the grass, the sod, there's so much pressure of water underneath it that it actually lifts up the sod. And if you were to just poke something through it, the water will spit out and it'll start to go down. So usually it's just a puddle when you walk on it. If it's an area that's always wet, that's just uncharacteristic of that area, it's best to dig down and check to see what's going on if you know there's an irrigation line there. Or on rare occasions, we get those really fun turf bubbles that occur.
Okay, so we have one last question, unless anyone else is going to chime in. Please post the bee lawn seed ordering sites. And I can answer that a little bit. So the University of Minnesota has a bee lab, and they also have information on bee lawns. And we can definitely include that link when I send out the email tomorrow. I'll send out a follow-up email to the webinar. We'll include that link, and we'll also include links that Ryan has referred to in the presentation, so you'll have those immediately. Also, our website's a great resource for more information on this series, and also on things like research that we're doing in bee lawns too. I don't know, Ryan, if you had any specific, or if anyone else had any specific information on bee lawn seed.
No, I got to look into it myself, so I'm right there with them.
I think, you know, we probably aren't going to list particular vendors on the university site, but there's a lot of good resources that you'll find at those links that Chris sends out. And we do have a list of vendors who, at our turf site, vendors who sell turfgrass seed that have good availability for some of our lower input grasses. And some of those same vendors carry some of the bee lawn mixes, so you'll have to call around. But we're seeing more and more availability of bee lawn mixes, certainly over the last year or two.
And then we just have one comment. A person has said that they sell it at Clyers in, where did they say? In South Minneapolis. So I guess that's one option. We don't recommend one vendor over another. That's just for information. So I think that's the last question. So Ryan, if there's anything else you want to say before we wrap it up, Ryan or Shane?
I just want to say thank you to everybody for having me, especially the Metropolitan Council.
Yes, and thank you, Ryan, for being our presenter today, and also to Eric and Brian Davis of the Metropolitan Council for being kind of panelists and helping with previous webinars, and also to Chris for helping out with the Q&As during these webinar series. So again, there's some information for Ryan, and in previous webinars, you have my information. For any further questions that you might have, feel free to reach out to us via email. And just to end, I want to say thank you to all of our participants and those of you who have watched and been a part of this webinar series. Obviously, we want to get as much information out to the public as well. And hopefully something you learn from here, you can share with someone else as you begin to talk about taking care of lawns and how to use water wisely. So with that, we'll kind of leave it here, and please fill out the survey that's sent out as well later. We might end up doing this at a later date if things continue to be kind of socially distanced and we are not able to meet together. And so the things and topics you suggest to us might be things we can talk about at a later date. So with that, thanks again, everyone, for participating, and we'll look forward to seeing you again at some point.